Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in tonight. We have a special story delivered to us by the fantastic Dark Owl Publishing, written by one of their many amazing authors, and I can't thank them enough. Both the publisher, both the writer. You guys are more than fantastic. Everybody, please enjoy tonight's reading of The Seductive Flask of Mr. Reynolds by John A. Frochio. Submitted by Dark Owl Publishing LLC. You do not need to know who I am. My identity is of no importance. The following is my secret account, to the best of my knowledge and weak memory, of the events leading to the premature demise of my renowned acquaintance, Edgar Allen Poe. It was on October 3rd, 1849, that Poe was found on the streets of Baltimore, delirious and in great distress, according to the published account of Joseph W. Walker. He was immediately taken to Washington College Hospital, where he eventually died on Sunday, October 7th, at 5 a.m. He was never coherent enough to explain the circumstances of his condition. He was wearing clothing that was not his own and repeatedly called out the name Reynolds the night before his death. The cause of death was reported as congestion of the brain or cerebral inflammation, which were common euphemisms for a variety of possible causes, often related to heavy alcohol consumption. To this day, the actual cause of Poe's death remains a mystery, and the person referred to by the singular reference of Reynolds was never definitively identified. My account may fill in some of the holes in this mystery, though I certainly don't make any claims as such. I can say with assurance that I knew a man named Mr. Reynolds, and that Mr. Poe was also acquainted with him, but I cannot say for certain whether Poe was referring to this Reynolds or not. You can form your own judgment on the matter when you have heard my account. Two of my most singularly curious yet companionable acquaintances were Mr. Poe and Mr. Reynolds. They lived such vastly different lives that I often wondered how they got along with one another. Poe, of course, was a writer. Reynolds was a chemist. Poe worked in a dimly lit room, which had barely enough space to accommodate his furious pacing. Reynolds worked in a large and busy laboratory among many tables, tubes, and flasks, well lit by a long row of south-facing windows. Reynolds dressed like a man of wealth, while Poe dressed more casually. Reynolds' garments were imported French silk with bold colors, while Poe wore light trousers and pale-colored frock coats. Reynolds also carried an ornate, ivory-carved oriental cane with a gold ferrule and malacca shaft. These two disparate figures became acquainted through their association with me. I ran a local establishment, which I will not name, which provided both liquid beverages and rowdy camaraderie. Both visited my establishment on various occasions, and I got to know each of them fairly well. Bartenders tend to learn a lot about their patrons. One day I had occasion to introduce Poe and Reynolds to one another. Knowing their temperaments, I expected they would engage each other in many fascinating discussions, and my intuition proved correct. In fact, their conversations often proved quite lively, especially considering they disagreed on most subjects. They often drew an audience from my more regular patrons. Their discussions encompassed a wide variety of topics, the most invigorating ones touching on subjects as diverse as politics, religion, morality and ethics, modern culture, science and technology. Happily, neither ever grew very angry for very long, and most discussions culminated in a series of witty exchanges and insulting barbs which were never truly mean-spirited. Every conversation, no matter how heated they became, always ended on a cordial note. The actual events of consequence began on the last evening they shared a drink and lively discourse together at my establishment. That evening, in late September, was an uncommonly chilly one for that time of year. Reynolds arrived much later than usual. I I remember Poe teasing him a bit on this matter. "Reynolds," he boomed. "I feared the worst. I was afraid that the heavens had opened up and swallowed you for your blasphemies." "Your dreams were not so easily fulfilled tonight, Poe. Perhaps another time. I expect you were composing a PM to my life, imagining a dire predicament for me similar to what I have read in your grotesque tales. You would not be so lucky as to be immortalized by the likes of me. Bartender, bring a whiskey for my friend and a cognac for me." I brought the drinks. After a few minutes of friendly banter, Reynolds revealed the true reason for his tardiness. "I was working late on a private experiment. I have a small laboratory set up in my basement that allows me the opportunity to engage in my own personal experiments, to investigate my own ideas outside of my mundane work environment." Poe said, "Tell me more." "I have never spoken of this to anyone else before, but tonight I believe I have made a breakthrough of great significance. My mad idea might actually be possible, and I am exploding inside to tell someone about it. In utmost confidentiality, of course." Reynolds looked at both Poe and myself. "Of course," I said. After a moment, Poe said, "Are you going to make us guess?" He hesitated and glanced around. No one but Poe and I were within listening range of his disclosure. His voice went softer. "Well, it is an elixir." He paused again, perhaps for dramatic effect. "It is an elixir of longevity. Immortality, my friends, is what I'm talking about." I was too astonished to speak. Poe, however, was not so reticent with his response. He said, "Why, that is immoral. You are stomping on God's grounds, my friend. Reynolds, what have you done?" Reynolds strongly reacted to Poe's words, appearing insulted. "Why, nothing, Poe. It is still only experimental, and it would certainly not prolong life indefinitely. When God says your time is up, your time is up. My elixir, however, may eventually bring about much longer lifespans for our mortal bodies." "I still think this is blasphemy, Reynolds. You cannot breathe more life into a man than God has already predestined." "Who says whether God has not predestined longer lives in the future? No one can say. Only God knows. Perhaps I am being used to this end." Poe shook his head vigorously. "Do not pretend to be God's minister of life. You cannot direct God's plans. Reynolds, can't you see you must cease and desist from this egregious insult at once?" Poe's voice was growing louder by now, and he was beginning to attract attention from my other patrons. Reynolds laughed softly. "Do not worry, my friend. I thank you for your concern. I will take your warnings into consideration. However, you know me well enough to realize I most likely cannot and will not cease and desist." The rest of the evening never recovered. Poe was not himself and eventually retired early. His parting words were terse. Reynolds looked to me. I shrugged and offered a bittersweet grin. I had no opinion on the matter. I saw neither Poe nor Reynolds over the next several days. Nearly a week later, I believe it was a Monday, Reynolds came alone into my tavern. He appeared to be in a highly distressed state. His clothing, normally quite neat, disheveled and mismatched. His face, normally clean-shaven, covered with dark stubble. His eyes were glassy and eerily stared off in the distance. His demeanor was curt and his movements jerky. He ordered 2 drinks and downed both within seconds of their arrival. My policy in regard to patrons who were in some sort of distress was generally to leave them alone while discreetly monitoring their alcohol intake. In this case, however, I felt the need to step in and pursue more vigorously the cause of his consternation. He was slow to respond to my casual inquiry, but soon divulged everything. "Poe paid me a visit last night," he began in a relatively calm voice. He spoke as though reciting a detailed, boring technical tract. "Poe told me he wanted to apologize for the way he excoriated me at our last encounter. I invited him in for tea. We talked for a while on mundane topics. Eventually he brought up the matter of the elixir. 'I was wondering,' he said, 'if I might see your lab. It is the scientist in me who is so curious, if you have no objections.' How could I object? he was my friend. Why, not at all, I told him. I would be honored and delighted to show you my private laboratory. I expect I overdid it a bit there. It may have seemed that I was mocking him, as if he saw it as such. He indicated nothing to me in that regard. I led him down a narrow stairwell, lit only by the small candle I carried, which flickered with each step I took. He commented on the mildew odor and dampness to which I had long ago grown accustomed. I lit several candles on a table at the bottom of the stairwell, full of clutter. My workroom came into view. 2 tables lined one wall, full to flowing with a large assortment of lab equipment, flasks, tubes, bottles, steel implements of every sort, a small microscope, notebooks, and scattered papers. I admit to not being the most cleanly of people, especially when I absorbed by my work. Poe was immediately drawn to one item from all my paraphernalia. A flask filled with a golden, glistening elixir. "That's it?" he asked, pointing. I told him it was indeed. After a moment of intense scrutiny, he picked it up gently and asked, "How do you know that this elixir can truly prolong one's life?" "Of course, I cannot know for certain. That would take observations of many, many years' time, which I do not have. Experiments on rats and other animals have provided me with some evidence. Shorter periods of time can be used to elevate and extrapolate the evidence of a stalled or delayed aging process." "How many doses are required?" he asked. "Would you take the elixir on a regular schedule?" "I have no answers yet. As I say, time will tell." "An inexorable time," he said. Poe stared for a long time at the flask. I became very unsettled by his obsession. It wasn't like him to be so possessed. His eyes were wide, transfixed. I was convinced I was watching the emergence of one of his mad characters from out of the pages of his darkest tales. I tugged at his arm and told him we should return upstairs for fear of the effects of the dampness on his breathing. He took some effort for me to drag him away from the flask. He left shortly afterwards. He was different. His actions, his hesitant speech, his absent-mindedness, all of this indicated a changed man. He was clearly obsessed by my flask of longevity. As he was leaving, I told him the elixir is in its early experimentation, Poe. I cannot predict any adverse side effects at this time. It is a long way from human trials. Poe nodded as he left. I doubted that he heard or understood my words. I fear for Poe. He is obsessed. I admit I have been avoiding him. I don't know what the man who wrote The Telltale Heart is capable of doing. After Reynolds finished his tale, he fell again into a morose silence. I offered a few words of assurance. Poe is a rational man, I told him. He won't let his emotions overcome him. You'll see. But how could I convince Reynolds when I wasn't convinced myself? After I poured another drink for the shaken chemist, I attended to my other customers. When I returned, I discovered Reynolds had gone, leaving more than enough bills to cover his tab plus a generous tip. At this point, I must stop a moment to warn you that the events of my tale will quickly become even more strange, disturbing, and even sinister. I implore you to stop reading my account if you have a weak stomach or gentle sensibilities. The next evening, Poe arrived at his usual time, looking quite dapper and cheerful. Though he never dressed poorly, that evening he was better dressed and groomed than usual. His demeanor was also more cheery than usual. He appeared to be a new man. I commented on his appearance. "I'm feeling alive this evening," he explained. "I don't know why." Aloud he said, "A round of drinks for everyone." Over a dozen regulars were there, and they cheered. This was definitely not the Poe I knew. At that moment I recognized the clothing Poe was wearing was not his usual attire, but in fact the clothing of Reynolds. It was in fact the very clothing I had seen Reynolds wear on the evening he revealed his distressing tale about Poe. I said, "Mr. Poe, have you seen our dear friend Mr. Reynolds lately?" He dipped his head briefly. "I believe not. Not for a week, I think." I decided to push him further. "It was not too long ago that I saw him dressed in much the same way as yourself. That is curious indeed." As I walked away to wait on a new customer, I noted that Poe was looking at his clothing with a puzzled expression. He was clearly confused. When I returned to Poe, he grabbed me by the sleeve and said, "Have you spoken to Reynolds? What did he tell you?" "Only that he was concerned for your well-being." I shook off his hand. He went on, "My mind is unclear. I awoke this morning invigorated and full of cheer, but my memory of the past few days was muddy. I couldn't put it all together in my head." Poe's confusion seemed genuine. His eyes, however, were the eyes of a madman. Wide open, glassy, darting back and forth. I was uncertain of what I should say or do next. Should I call for medical help? Should I call the authorities? What evidence would I have of any illness or wrongdoing? I realized I had only a vague feeling, nothing substantial. I chose my next words very carefully. "Why don't you tell me what you can remember?" Everything came out in an explosion of words. Words not directed at me. "Cease and desist your torments, demons," shouted Poe. "I rebuke you in the name of God. Where are all the bright lights coming from? Go away." What is that? What is that, my dear friend Reynolds out there in the bright light? He's standing in the way. Get out of my way, Reynolds. He's fighting me. Stop fighting me, Reynolds. He's pushing me, pulling me back. Stop it, Reynolds. I struggle in his arms, and I easily overcome him. I knock him down and beat him with his own precious cane. He doesn't try to stop me anymore. The white light again, so bright. I can see the flask now. There it is, sitting all alone in the high middle of the table. It glistens, and it sparkles with a golden liquid inside. It's molten gold with diamonds floating within. The flask is cold to my touch, but warms up quickly as I wrap my hands around it. I lift it high. Poe's voice went softer now. I see the damn white light again, blinding me, then fading into a bedroom with a neatly made bed. I'm so tired. I fall into the bed and sleep. Bright lights consume me in my sleep. Hollow chamber music echoes around me. I'm dizzy. The next thing I know, I'm getting dressed. I don't recognize these clothes, but I put them on anyway. It's a brand new day, a new beginning. I follow the bright light, which is now a shining star high in the sky. Joy and peace fill my heart. Joy and peace. Poe grew morose. That's when I saw Reynolds again. Slowly, he walked towards me, brandishing an empty flask. "Why, Poe? Why?" he kept saying over and over again. He follows me everywhere I go now, shaking the empty flask at me and crying, "Why, Poe, why?" I can't get rid of him. He always finds me. Tell me, is he behind me? I told him no, but he is nearby. I feel his presence. Then, strangely enough, he cheered up again. "Another round of drinks! For everyone!" The crowd cheered again. Those who were still there filled everyone's drinks and added them to Poe's tab. I looked over at Poe. Poe had adequate funds to cover his tab, but I worried more about his mental health than his financial health. I was more concerned about his horrible delusions. What I feared most was maybe they weren't delusions at all. Had he actually hurt Reynolds, drank the elixir from the flask, and was now being hounded by Reynolds? Or did something more sinister take place? Was Reynolds dead? I shuddered. I couldn't bring myself to question Poe further on the subject. Poe grew quieter and more withdrawn as the evening progressed. One by one, my other patrons left until Poe was the last man standing. The clock drew nigh on closing time. I observed his drawn face and half-empty glass of cognac, and held nothing but pity for the poor man. I decided to let him finish his drink before I asked him to depart the premises. It was only a moment later, having turned around to attend the cleaning tables, that I heard Poe suddenly shriek, "Begone, Reynolds! Why do you torture me so? I've done nothing wrong." I turned and found Poe facing the door. From my position, I caught a glimpse of a dark figure contained within the shadows of the open door. I couldn't make out who or what it might be. "Is that you, Reynolds?" I called out. "Show yourself." As I approached the door, the figure disappeared into the shadows. I trembled in a sudden chill breeze that emanated from the half-open door. Afterwards, I was not certain whether I had imagined the shadowy figure or not. It may have simply been a trick of the eyes. I hastily bolted the door shut and turned the sign to closed. By now, Poe was highly agitated, up from his seat and pacing furiously one moment, spinning back and forth on the bar stool the next moment. I grabbed Poe by the shoulders and shook him. "Snap out of it, Poe, you're going mad. What is distressing you so? Can you remember anything more about your encounter with Reynolds?" "I'm afraid. I fear I might have killed Reynolds, and now his ghost torments me." I let him go and step back. "I don't know for certain. It may have all been a dream, or a dream within a dream. Do you hear it now? The telltale sound of his cane tapping on the pavement as he walks, coming for me." He spun around and looked toward the door. I said, "I hear nothing." He stopped. "But surely it's him." Then I noticed Poe had a cane. It was Reynolds' fancy cane. "Poe, is that Reynolds' cane you have there?" He dropped it like a hot iron. It clattered noisily to the floor. I picked it up. "This is Reynolds' cane. You cannot be hearing Reynolds' cane outside in the street when you have his cane right here." He shook his head vigorously. "Yeah, clearly I heard him." "Did you kill him, Poe?" No, I don't know. It seemed so real, yet it was so dreamlike. I wanted the flask. I wanted to drink the elixir. I wanted to live forever. I remember knocking Reynolds down because he stood in my way. I remember taking the flask, holding it up to the light, watching it glisten like liquid gold. But I don't remember drinking the elixir. I remember waking up from a long and peaceful sleep. That's all I remember. And Reynolds? I never saw him again, until he started haunting me this day. Poe, this is what you must do. You must call the police and tell them to go to Reynolds' house. That is the only way you'll find out what really happened. Yes, I must. I'll call them tomorrow. You know, it's the only way you can end this madness. Yes, I know, he said. Tomorrow. Abruptly, he left. That was the last I saw Poe. Later, I heard about Poe's delirium, his admittance to the hospital, and his subsequent death. I only knew Poe a short while, but I will miss him. After Poe's untimely demise, Reynolds began coming around again. This took me by surprise, as I had presumed Poe had likely killed poor Reynolds. We barely talked about Poe, except how we will both miss his lively conversations. Mr. Reynolds has outlived all my other patrons, and even many of my son's patrons after my son took over the business. I occasionally stop by to see how my son is doing. I often notice how Reynolds appears to have not aged a single day in all those years since we had known the inimitable Mr. Edgar Allen Poe. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in tonight to our very special story. I'm not sure why Poe would want an elixir of immortality when his name is already sealed in the aeons by his literature. Whether it be his lost notes to his dear sweethearts, or perhaps the morbid poetry that has made his name. Though it is good to see that Mr. Reynolds has secured his own way of making a legacy. A special thank you once again to Dark Owl Publishing. You can find more of their fantastical stories, both sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, all listed up on their website. And you can learn more about the author in the link below. And to Mr. Frochio, thank you for letting me read your story. Everybody, please enjoy your night. Sit back and enjoy some R&R.